And it's an absolute delight to get in the next guest, Sajjid Chinoy, Chief India Economist at JP Morgan, joins in right now to talk about his thoughts on, well, lots of developments around the world. Sajjid, so good talking to you. Thanks for taking the time out.
Niraj, good morning. Always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Sajjid, simple question to start off. This uncertainty around trade deals, I mean, how do you foresee the impact of something like this, which is wavering so much and not quite steady? How do you wrap your head around forecasting an impact of such a set of events?
Niraj, it's very hard to forecast this because this is truly unprecedented. You know, in years past, we've seen external shocks. We've seen wars, we've seen pandemics, you've seen droughts. And the whole idea of economic policy is to offset or mitigate the impact of those shocks, right? And thereby introduce more certainty in a world of exogenous uncertainty. I think what we're seeing in the last 6 months is, and this is quite remarkable, that economic policy itself is the source of uncertainty, which we haven't seen, in decades. And the fact is, I don't think this is ending anytime soon. I know the US administration has said that there is another month and tariffs will kick in on August 1st, but it's entirely possible that, this gets pushed out further and we're living in this constant, sense of uncertainty. So modeling this is extremely, ambitious and difficult. But I think this is quite worrying because I think, the last thing that business wants is uncertainty. We've already begun to see growth in the US through all of the noise, weekly, monthly noise, slow quite meaningfully. We expect in the first half of 2025, US growth will have averaged just 1.25%. So you've begun to see that, the policy uncertainty has begun to affect economic actors. It's important to note that even if the announcements of this week do not result in higher tariffs, US effective tariffs today are close to 14%. And to put this in perspective, last year, the effective tariff rate was about 2.5%. So you've seen a 5 or 6 time increase in tariffs. And, there is no free lunch in economics. Eventually, this is going to impact either consumer prices or profit margins of firms, either the exporting country or the importing country. So there will be an economic impact. So I think the future, it remains very uncertain and, will weigh heavily on how we think about economies going forward.
Sajjid, let's put this into perspective. US second half growth slows down. China, presumably people believe the second half would be visibly weak. And if indeed, as you said, right, the countries or companies in the exporting countries could hit profit margins and thereby growth there might get impacted. So a synchronized slowdown of sorts, very likely over the next 6 to 12 months. What's the antidote to this? Would it be monetary policy, a synchronized monetary policy action by central banks across the world? And is something like that even possible in such a disjointed world now?
It's a great question, Niraj. So I think, as you saw it, second half, we worry about synchronized slowdown. The US is expected to slow. China has begun to slow. For me, the biggest concern is Asia. And I say Asia outside of India. I think about the ASEAN economies, because the first half of this year, they've benefited enormously from front loading. So exports, in ASEAN economies and the rest of Asia until the middle of the year is running at a 20% annualized rate. That's never going to sustain. Why is it running at these rates? Because exporters have been front loading heavily, anticipating tariffs to pick up later in the year. And you've also seen a lot of transshipment that's come from China through ASEAN economies, through Vietnam, through Thailand, to the US. So in a way, the shock has been buffered because of front loading and transshipment. So even if tariffs don't go up from these levels, you will see a sharp slowdown in the second half in the rest of Asia because the front loading is going to unwind and because the US is going to frown on the transshipment. We've seen every letter that's gone out this week has kind of warned countries that if they begin to transship, they'll attract higher tariffs. So you worry about a synchronized slowdown in the second half. Now, what is the policy antidote here? The difficulty in the US is that this is an adverse supply shock. Both tariffs and immigration will hurt growth, but will push up prices. When your effective tariff rate goes from 2.5% to, at least 15% and climbing, eventually inflation is going to go up. And so the Fed is going to be cautious to see, well, on the one hand, growth is slowing. On the other hand, inflation is going up, and they will readily be patient. They may not be preemptive. in cutting interest rates. Now, the rest of the world is in a different situation because to the extent that exports to the US are blocked by higher US tariffs, the rest of the world will be floating with more excess capacity. We've seen that China's export performance this year has been remarkably resilient, not because exports to the US have not come down. They've come down by 40% the last 2 months. It's because China has found other markets, in Asia, in the rest of the world. Now, all that excess capacity is going to be disinflationary. So I worry less about inflation outside the US. And I think that is going to give central banks in around the world, and especially in Asia, space to keep cutting. It's important to recognize we're already in the midst of pretty long monetary easing cycles, including in India. But is there space in some countries to keep extending monetary policy? It is. Will that be enough is a question mark because around the world post-pandemic, fiscal policy has been constrained. So if you're looking at a sharp external slowing, yes, monetary policy will do its thing. Will that be enough in Asia and the rest of Asia remains an open question.
No, pertinent point. But Sajjid, then, does an economy or the two pillars, which is monetary and fiscal policy, try and focus on consumption as opposed to capex-led growth? Because I would reckon that it would be unwisely to expect the private sector to announce meaningful capex plans in times of such uncertainty, and government capex can only take the baton. I mean, the pressure as much. Thus far, India has done that, but private capex has been amiss. Maybe it still stays amiss. So does the government, therefore, for example, in India, focus on consumption for the next intermediate period of 6 to 12 months until the dust hopefully settles down?
So, Niraj, in the case of India, I think a couple of points are worth making. I think the first thing, and I think this is something the government's been focused on, is to try and find sources to reduce this exogenous uncertainty. And what do I mean by that? I think the fact that we have a trade deal with the UK is very encouraging. I think we must make every effort to sign a conclude a deal with the US in the coming weeks. I'm hoping we're close and to get over that line. And I think it's important to also have a trade deal with the EU before the end of this year. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because of transshipment concerns in the rest of Asia, you will see ASEAN and the rest of Asian tariffs go up closer towards Chinese levels to prevent the kind of arbitrage we've been seeing in the first 6 months of this year. So India can secure a 10% tariff with the US and have free trade agreements with the EU and the UK, and the rest of Asia has got higher tariffs. There'll be compelling incentives or push factors for businesses looking to expand, looking to do the China plus one to this time truly move out of the China orbit and move towards India. So I think the first thing we need to do is kind of push on those trade deals so that we can assure exporters, both Indian as well as multinational companies, that if you produce out of India, you have relatively frictionless access to global markets. Now, as you said, that is going to take some time to fructify. Domestic demand will have to, buffer some of the impact of the external slowing. I think two rotations are important in India over the next year. We've seen urban consumption has done a lot of the heavy lifting the last 2-3 years, but there are signs that inevitably at some point urban consumption will slow, and we've seen signs of that. It's therefore important that rural consumption pick up and take some of the pressure off urban. That's the first rotation. I think it's important. The second rotation, and you alluded to this, will be tougher. Public investment, again, has done a lot of the heavy lifting. Their fiscal constraints will eventually bind. Public capex will grow, but cannot grow at the 20%, 30% pace that we saw 3 years ago. And so at some point, private capex will have to pick up. That is going to take a little bit of time for the reasons you mentioned. In these times of unprecedented uncertainty, private capex will hope to be in the sidelines. So you're right that consumption will have to, bear the brunt of the growth impulse over the next year. Urban is slowing, so rural has to pick up. I'll make a final point here that, the good news is that some of the prerequisites seem to be falling into place. If you look at inflation over the next 6 months, it's tracking less than 3%. Inflation is running at about, it's expected to average between June and December, 2.5%, right? If you get those levels of inflation, that's going to open up purchasing power for households. We're in the midst of a monetary easing cycle. hopefully, as lending rates go down, that will spur some consumption. We've had 2 strong monsoons. Agricultural production should be strong. That should help agricultural, the agricultural economy. And you had a budget where you had some tax cuts. So if you put the tax cuts, the monetary easing, the lower inflation and the strong monsoon, hopefully some of the prerequisites fall into place. This is important because for private investment to pick up in India, they need demand visibility. External visibility is going to be low. There's a lot of fogginess in the global economy. So you need domestic demand to provide that visibility, and consumption will have to step up over the next year.
Okay. Sajjid, could GST tinkering be one small thing that can be done? I mean, at least the belief was until Operation Sindoor happened and then the large defense capex was announced that there was some fiscal headroom to announce a small fiscal push. Maybe that is done away with because of the capex plans around defense. But I'm just wondering, could GST be an answer, GST tinkering of rates in select categories which need a push, or would you recommend something else the government to do to help boost consumption?
So I think there are 2 questions here. The broader question is, does fiscal policy have space? And I would argue at this point it likely doesn't. I think it's very important for fiscal policy to be countercyclical in both directions. When you have a shock, you must extend support. But when public debt levels are above 80% as they are, remember the combined fiscal deficit, center and states and PSUs, last year the center was at 4.8, states were at 3.2. That's 8% combined deficit. And then you've got the PSU. So you're looking at, somewhere around 8% combined deficit. That's a large deficit. India will need to preserve fiscal gunpowder for future shocks precisely because the world is so uncertain. So I would not recommend at this point that we go off the fiscal consolidation path, which has served us so well in the last few years. Can you tinker a few GST rates? If things have to be rationalized on a one-off basis, that's understandable. But generally, I think tinkering with tax rates, again, increases uncertainty. So I think some rationalization, is perhaps desirable, but I think constant tinkering will create another level of uncertainty that we want to avoid. So I think we have to accept the fact that fiscal policy doesn't have space. Monetary policy will have to do the heavy lifting. I think trade policy is important, and we have to go back to chipping away at structural reforms. Even in the rest of Asia, the fact is old growth models are now being challenged in the rest of Asia, manufacturing and exports. And so you have to find new growth drivers, which requires the harder slog of sustained, structural reform.
So therefore, my final question out here is that if there is not enough room and working with that assumption that the monetary policy is done, the bulk of the heavy lifting in the new RBI regime, if you will, and maybe some more left, but are we out of ammo, and do we have to leave it to the cycle to fend for itself? Is that what is the way ahead?
I would not say that, Niraj. I would not say that. I think the monetary policy has done a lot of the front loading. But remember, inflation over the next 6 months is tracking 100 basis points below the RBI's forecast. Right now, let's see if that sustains, because food price shocks are notoriously volatile. But if you do get inflation that's averaging, our forecast is 3.2% for this year. Then space for more monetary policy will open up later in the year. I think trade policy has a lot of things it can do to mitigate uncertainty. And structural reforms, the ammo is never exhausted. There's lots of ammo to use over there. So I think there are many instruments that policymakers have beyond the traditional fiscal policy that I think we should preserve for the future.
Okay. Let's hope all of that works out. Sajjid Chinoy, you just as we wrap up this conversation, are you concerned about growth in India, or do you believe we'll wait through?
Well, I think we're looking at 6.5% growth, which in this global environment is very good. It's sound, it's consistent. But as an economist, my belief always is that given India's demography, given our stage of development, what we really need to do is aspire for another percentage point of growth. We have to take that 6.5% average and consistently grow at 7.5% given our per capita incomes. So the question is, what sort of structural reforms does India need in the coming years to take that growth path from 6.5 to 7.5, which will not be easy given the global headwinds? It's not easy, but it's not insurmountable. I believe very much in the power of compounding. that if you can grow at 7.5% for the next decade versus 6.5%, the impact on per capita incomes a decade out is remarkable.
Desirable as well, and maybe important from a perspective of ensuring that job losses or or the workforce getting added every
I'll
year.
say one last thing, Niraj.
Yeah.
I think we've spoken about this before, that growth rates are important, and I think getting the capital labor ratio balance is equally important. We're in a world where you've seen inexorable progress of capital productivity, and so manufacturing around the world is becoming more and more capital intensive. That's okay if you're a large economy in which populations are declining and the labor force is contracting. But in India's case, over the next 10 years, we're going to have large increases in labor force participation. How do we get that balance right where labor has every chance to compete with capital? And I think that's where the policy focus will continue to need to be.
What a tricky time, if you will, for the powers in India to navigate over the next 10 years. But Sajjid Chinoy, thank you so much for pointing all of this out, and I'm sure that everybody's listening to this and your wise words of wisdom. So much appreciate you taking the time out and speaking with us today on NDTV Profit.